Welcome back to another historical journey. If you're new here, this channel takes you into the lives of real people at the most defining moments in history. Through their eyes, in their world, in their silence. Take a moment to get comfortable. Close your eyes. Let your body settle. And when you're ready, we begin. If you were the man who started the French Revolution, the morning began the way all bad mornings do. Not with noise, not with violence, with silence. You opened your eyes before dawn, the way you always did, out of habit more than intention. The ceiling above your bed was the same cracked plaster it had always been. The single window at the far end of the room showed a sky still caught between night and something that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to become day. For a moment, you simply lay there, listening. Somewhere below the building, a cart moved slowly across cobblestones. A dog barked twice and then stopped. Further away, near the river, someone was already shouting about something you couldn't make out clearly. Paris was waking up. It always woke up angry these days. You turned onto your side and looked at your daughter. She was still asleep on the narrow mat beside yours, her knees pulled up toward her chest, her breathing slow and even. She was 7 years old. Her name was Elise. She had her mother's mouth and her mother's way of sleeping. Completely still, like the world couldn't touch her when her eyes were closed. You watched her for a moment longer than you should have. Then you got up. The floorboards were cold beneath your feet. You moved quietly across them, careful not to wake her. In the small corner that served as your kitchen, you checked the shelf where the bread was kept. Empty. You already knew it would be. You had checked it last night before sleeping, and the night before that, and the night before that. Checking had become a kind of ritual now. Not because you expected anything to have changed, but because stopping the ritual felt like admitting something you weren't ready to admit yet. You pulled your coat from the hook beside the door. It was heavier than it used to be, not because of weight, because you remembered when it was new. Outside, the city was already in motion. The streets near your building were narrow and uneven, the kind of streets that never fully dried even in summer because the buildings on either side stood close enough to block most of the light. You had lived in this quarter for 11 years. You knew every crack in every wall, every doorway where men slept when they had nowhere else to go. There were more of them now than there used to be. You passed a woman sitting on a low step outside a building 3 doors down. She had a child on her lap, a boy, maybe 4 years old, and she was rocking him slowly back and forth without looking at anything in particular. You had seen her before. You did not know her name. You nodded as you passed. She did not respond. Not rudeness, exhaustion. There was a difference, and you had learned it well enough over the past 2 years to recognize it immediately. The baker's shop was 6 streets away. You walked quickly, not because you were in a hurry, but because walking quickly gave the impression of purpose, and purpose kept certain kinds of attention away from you. The streets were filling now with the usual morning movement. Servants carrying water, merchants pulling carts, children running in directions that made no apparent sense. But underneath all of it, something was different. You felt it before you could name it. A tension in the air, like the city had been holding its breath for a very long time and was beginning to struggle with the effort. You turned the last corner. You turned the last corner. The baker's shop had a small crowd outside it already. Not a line. A crowd. That distinction mattered. Lines meant waiting. Crowds meant something had already gone wrong. You slowed your pace as you approached. A man near the back of the group turned and looked at you, and in his expression you read everything before a single word was spoken. "Nothing left," he said. "You stopped. Since when?" "Since yesterday afternoon." He shook his head slowly. "He says the flour didn't arrive. Says the suppliers are holding it back." Holding it back for what? The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone standing there already understood. The price would go up again. It had been going up for months now, steadily, quietly, in increments small enough that each individual increase felt almost manageable until you added them all together and realized you were spending twice what you had spent a year ago for half of what you used to bring home. You stood there for a moment outside the baker's empty shop and looked at the faces around you. Old men, young women, a boy holding a basket that was still empty, a man in a coat more threadbare than yours gripping the edge of the doorframe as if steadying himself against something invisible. All of them had walked here this morning with the same purpose. All of them were going home with nothing. You turned and began walking back. Elise was awake when you returned. She was sitting on the edge of her mat with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the door as if she had been waiting for it to open. When she saw your face, she didn't ask about the bread. She had stopped asking about bread the way she had stopped asking about her mother. Not because she had forgotten, but because she had learned that some questions only made the silence louder. You sat down beside her. For a moment, neither of you spoke. Then she leaned her head against your arm. You put your hand on top of hers. Outside, the city continued its noise, carts and voices and the distant sound of the river, indifferent and relentless, the way cities always were. You thought about the man outside the baker's shop, about the woman on the step, about the boy with the empty basket, about all the mornings exactly like this one stretching backward behind you and forward ahead of you like a road that led nowhere except further into itself. You thought about last winter, about the winter before that, about the small leather pouch where you kept what remained of your savings. Lighter now than it had ever been, light enough that you no longer kept it hidden because there was no longer enough inside it to be worth hiding. Elise shifted slightly against your arm. "Are you going out again?" she asked quietly. "Later," you said. She nodded. She didn't ask where. You went out again in the early afternoon. Not because you had somewhere specific to be, but because the room had begun to feel like it was shrinking, the walls pressing inward with a slowness that only became noticeable when you sat still long enough to pay attention to it. Elise had fallen back asleep. You left a small piece of dried meat on the shelf beside her mat, the last of what you had, and closed the door quietly behind you. The streets were fuller now than they had been in the morning. That was unusual. Normally, the midday hours thinned the crowd slightly as people returned home or retreated into whatever shade they could find. But today, the movement seemed to be going in one direction. Not purposefully, not organized, but pulled the way water finds a slope without being told where to go. You followed it without deciding to. The noise grew gradually as you walked. Not shouting yet. More like the sound a crowd makes when it is still deciding what kind of crowd it wants to be. You turned onto a wider street and immediately saw why. A group of men had gathered outside a large building near the corner. Some were standing. Some were sitting on the steps. A few were talking in low, urgent voices, while others simply watched the street with expressions that mixed anger and exhaustion in equal measure. You recognized one of them, Henri. He was a tanner who lived 2 streets over from you. You had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times over the years, brief conversations in doorways or at market stalls, the kind of exchanges that never quite crossed into friendship but sat just at the edge of it. He was a large man with slow, careful movements and a habit of listening more than he spoke. He saw you at the same moment you saw him. He nodded once. You walked over. "What is it?" you asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the crowd around him as if calculating something. "Necker," he said finally. You felt something shift in your chest. "When?" "This morning. The king dismissed him this morning." You said nothing. Jacques Necker had been the one man in the king's government that people like you, people with nothing left to lose and very little left to spend, had believed might actually do something. Whether that belief had been justified or not was almost beside the point. Belief itself had value when everything else was running short. And now that was gone too. "What does it mean?" someone beside you asked. A younger man, maybe 20, with the kind of face that still expected answers to questions like that. Henri looked at him steadily. "It means there is no one left who was even pretending to listen," he said. The young man absorbed this, So did you. Around you, the conversation had fragmented into a dozen smaller ones, overlapping and contradicting each other. Voices rising and falling like something looking for a shape it hadn't found yet. You listened without speaking. That was something you had always done. Listened before speaking, observed before acting, waited for the full picture before committing to any part of it. It had served you well in smaller circumstances. It had kept you out of trouble on several occasions when moving faster might have cost you something you couldn't afford to lose. But standing there in that street, surrounded by men who were hungry and frightened and furious in the particular way that only comes from having been patient for too long, you felt the habit of waiting begin to loosen its grip on you slightly. Just slightly, not enough to matter yet, but enough to notice. You stayed in that street for nearly an hour. By the time you left, the crowd had grown to perhaps 3 times its original size. Word was moving through the city faster than feet could carry it, jumping from street to street, corner to corner, building to building. The news of Necker's dismissal spreading outward like a crack moving through ice. You walked home a different way than you had come, not for any strategic reason, simply because you needed to think, and familiar streets made thinking harder by filling your mind with familiar things. The route took you past the market near the old church. The stalls were mostly empty now, or nearly so. A few vendors stood behind their tables with small piles of vegetables arranged with the kind of careful spacing that was meant to make a little look like more than it was. You recognized the trick because you had seen it so many times. You had used it yourself once in a different life when you still had things to sell. An old woman was arguing with a vendor over the price of onions. Her voice was low and tired rather than angry. The vendor's expression was not unkind exactly, but it was fixed, the expression of a man who had already had this conversation too many times today and had nothing new to offer it. You watched them for a moment, then kept walking. That evening, Henri came to your door. He was not alone. 2 other men were with him, a cobbler named Renard who you knew slightly, and a younger man Henri introduced simply as Thomas, who worked at one of the print shops near the river and had ink-stained fingers and the kind of restless energy that made him seem like he was always about to say something important. You let them in. The room felt smaller with 4 people in it. Elise watched from her corner with quiet, careful eyes. You caught her gaze and tilted your head toward the door. A signal you had developed between the 2 of you over the past year, wordless and efficient. She slipped outside without a sound. The 4 of you sat. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Henri placed his hands flat on the table and looked at each of you in turn. "The city is going to move," he said. "Not tomorrow, maybe not the day after, but soon." Renard nodded slowly. Thomas said nothing, but his fingers tapped once against his knee. You looked at Henri. "Move how?" you asked. "I don't know yet." He paused. "But I know it will. I've seen it building for 2 years. You've all seen it. The question is not whether it happens." He stopped. The candlelight shifted between you. "The question is what it becomes when it does." A silence followed that particular sentence. Not uncomfortable, weighted, the kind of silence that forms around a thought too large for immediate response. Renard spoke first. "There are men talking about Palais Royal," he said. "Tomorrow, a gathering." "There are always gatherings," Thomas said, and his voice had a bitter edge to it. "Men gather and talk and go home and nothing changes." "This feels different," Renard said. "It always feels different." "No," Renard shook his head slowly. "Not always. I have been saying for 3 years that it always feels different, and I have been right to be cautious. But this time," he paused, searching for the word. "This time the feeling has a weight to it that the other times didn't." You had been listening without speaking. All 3 of them looked at you. You realized they had been waiting for your response without making it obvious. "What do you want me to say?" you asked. Henry's expression was steady. "What you think," he said. "You always see things the rest of us miss. That's why you're here." You looked down at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the small dark not near the center of it that you had stared at during 100 meals and 100 conversations and 100 quiet nights when the room was empty and the silence had a different quality than it did now. I think, you said slowly, that hungry men with nothing left to lose are the most dangerous force in the world. Pause. And I think we have been hungry for long enough. No one responded immediately, but something in the room shifted, subtle, like a decision being made below the surface of words. Thomas stopped tapping his knee. Renard exhaled slowly. Henri nodded once, a small movement, almost invisible. Tomorrow then, he said quietly, not a question. After they left, you sat alone at the table for a long time. Elise came back in and curled onto her mat without speaking. Within minutes, her breathing had slowed into sleep. You remained at the table. The candle burned down to a short stub and you didn't replace it, letting the light diminish gradually until the room existed only in shadow and the faint gray glow coming through the window from the street outside. You thought about tomorrow, about what Henri had said, about what you had said, about the weight Renard had described, that particular heaviness that distinguished a moment which would change things from all the moments that merely felt like they would. You thought about Elise sleeping 3 feet away from you, about the empty shelf where bread should have been, about the woman on the step, about the boy with the empty basket, about the old woman arguing over the price of onions with the patient, exhausted expression of someone who had been losing small battles for so long that losing had become indistinguishable from living. At some point, you couldn't say exactly when the thinking stopped being thinking and became something else. Something quieter. Something that didn't have a name but sat in your chest like a stone that had finally found the bottom. You blew out the last of the candle. And in the darkness, for the first time in a long time, you slept without dreaming. The morning of July 12, 1789 arrived without ceremony. No thunder, no sign. No particular quality of light that distinguished it from the mornings before it. Just Paris waking up the way it always did. Slowly, noisily, indifferently. Unaware that by the time it went to sleep again, nothing would be the same. You were already awake before the city. You had barely slept. Not from anxiety exactly. More from a kind of alertness that had settled into your body sometime in the night and refused to leave. A low, persistent hum beneath the surface of everything, like a string pulled tight and left to vibrate on its own. You dressed quietly. Elise was still sleeping. You looked at her for a long moment. Longer than usual, though you couldn't have explained why. She was breathing slowly, her small hands tucked beneath her chin, completely still in the way she always was when she slept. You memorized it without meaning to. Then you left. The streets were different that morning. Not louder, not more crowded. The difference was harder to locate than that. Something in the quality of movement, the way people walked, the way eyes met and then quickly didn't. A collective holding of breath that the city had been practicing for weeks and had finally perfected. You reached Henry's building as the bells of a nearby church struck 7. He was already outside. So were Renard and Thomas. And behind them, to your mild surprise, 8 or 9 other men you recognized from the neighborhood. A carpenter, 2 laborers, a young student with a torn jacket and earnest eyes, an older man whose name you had never learned but whose face you had seen at the baker's shop every morning for years. They looked at you when you arrived, not as a leader. You were not a leader, but as a point of reference somehow. An anchor. You didn't understand it entirely. You weren't sure you wanted to. Henri fell into step beside you without preamble. More people are moving toward Palais Royal, he said quietly. Word went out last night through the print shops. Thomas made sure of it. You glanced at Thomas, who gave a small shrug that might have meant pride or might have meant fear. Probably both. How many? You asked. Enough, Henri said. That word again. Enough. You had heard it used as a threshold, as a measurement, as a prayer. You had never heard it used as a certainty before. But something in Henry's voice gave it that quality now. like a calculation that had finally resolved itself overnight into a clean and unambiguous answer. You walked. The group around you grew as you moved through the streets. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way a river gathers water without appearing to try. Men fell in from side streets and doorways and corners, drawn by something that operated below the level of conscious decision. Some of them knew each other. Most didn't. It didn't seem to matter. By the time you reached the outer edges of Palais Royal, the crowd was enormous. You stopped at the edge of it and simply looked. You had seen large gatherings before, market days, public executions, religious festivals, but this was different in a way that took a moment to fully absorb. The sheer density of people, yes, but more than that, the atmosphere they generated together. Something electric and fragile at the same time, like a storm that hadn't yet decided whether to break. Voices everywhere, fragments of argument and agreement and repetition floating above the crowd like smoke. Necker's name, the king's name, the price of bread, the price of flour, the soldiers massing at the edges of the city. That last one you had heard only as rumor until now. But looking at the faces around you, the fear threading through the anger like a second current running beneath the first, you understood it was more than rumor. The king was preparing for something, and the city knew it. You moved through the crowd slowly. Henri stayed close. The others spread out naturally around you. At the center of the gardens, near the long colonnaded walkways, smaller groups had formed around individuals who were speaking. Some passionately, some desperately, some with the practiced cadence of men who had been preparing their words for this moment for a long time. You listened to several of them. Some spoke about rights, about the estates, about constitutional principles and historical precedents and the proper relationship between a king and his people. Important words, true words, perhaps, but not the words you heard in them. What you heard beneath all of it, in the pauses between sentences, in the way voices cracked slightly on certain syllables, in the faces of the men and women listening, was something simpler and more urgent than philosophy. Hunger, exhaustion, the particular desperation of people who had waited past the point where waiting made sense and had nowhere left to put the weight of it. You stood still in the middle of the moving crowd and felt it pressing against you from all sides. Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, in whatever part of a person registers the accumulated suffering of thousands of others existing in close proximity. It was almost unbearable. And then you heard it, not loudly. It came from somewhere to your left. A man reading aloud from a pamphlet, his voice carrying just far enough to reach you over the general noise of the crowd. He was quoting someone, a woman, a royal woman, and the words she had allegedly spoken when told that the people of Paris had no bread. Let them eat cake. You had heard those words before. Everyone had, but you had heard them in the abstract, as a story, as a rumor, as the kind of thing people repeated to each other in the way they repeated all the small cruelties of the powerful, cataloging them without quite knowing what to do with the catalog. Hearing them now, in this place, surrounded by all of this, something happened inside you that you could not have predicted or prepared for. It was not rage exactly. Rage was hot and fast and consumed itself quickly. This was different. This was cold, clear, absolute. Like a door that had been slightly ajar for a very long time finally swinging all the way open. You looked around you at the crowd, at the faces, at the hunger in them and the fear and the anger and the exhaustion and the particular expression worn by people who have been told, in 1,000 different ways over 1,000 different days, that their suffering is either invisible or deserved. And something in you, something you had no name for, something that had been building since the first empty shelf and the first cold morning and the first time Elise had stopped asking questions because she already knew the answers, rose up through your chest and into your throat. You moved without deciding to move, through the crowd, toward a low stone ledge along the edge of the colonnade. Henri saw you and reached out to grab your arm. "What are you doing?" he said. You looked at him, and in his face you saw the same thing you had seen in the crowd, but also something else. Something that might have been hope. or recognition, or both. You pulled your arm gently free and climbed up onto the ledge. The people nearest to you noticed first. A small ripple of attention moving outward, heads turning, voices dropping slightly, a shifting of bodies as people became aware of a presence elevated above the crowd. You stood up there and for one long moment said absolutely nothing. Your heart was loud in your ears. Your hands were not entirely steady. Below you, faces, dozens of them, then more, turned upward. Strangers, hungry strangers, frightened strangers, people exactly like you. You opened your mouth, and you spoke, not with the polished cadence of the men you had listened to earlier, not with philosophical frameworks or historical arguments or carefully constructed rhetoric. You spoke the way a person speaks when they have run out of every reason not to. You spoke about the bread, about the shelf that was always empty, about the walk to the baker's that always ended the same way, about children who had stopped asking questions because they had learned that questions led nowhere, about men who worked until their hands broke down and still could not feed their families, about waiting, about being told to wait, about waiting anyway and waiting still and waiting past the point where waiting was patience and into the territory where it became complicity. Your voice cracked on certain words. You didn't try to control it. The crowd had gone quiet. Not entirely. Paris was never entirely quiet, but quiet enough that your voice, which was not a large voice, which was not trained or powerful or accustomed to carrying across open spaces, reached further than it had any right to. You said the words you had heard moments ago. Let them eat cake. You said them quietly, and something passed through the crowd like a current through water. A sound rose, low at first, then louder still. You stood on the ledge and felt it building beneath you like the ground itself was changing state. From solid to something less stable, something with movement in it, something that had been held in place by pressure alone and was now, finally, releasing. You did not call for the Bastille. You did not give orders or directions or a plan. You simply said what was true. And the truth, on that particular morning, in that particular place, among those particular people, was enough. What happened next did not feel like history. It felt like water finding a crack. The crowd moved, not all at once, not in a single organized surge, but in the way that large things move when they have finally stopped resisting their own weight. Gradually, then suddenly, then irreversibly, you climbed down from the ledge. Henri was beside you immediately. His face had changed. The careful, measured expression he usually wore had been replaced by something rawer, something that sat between awe and alarm. "You did that," he said. "I said words," you replied. "Those were not just words." You didn't argue, because you already knew he was right. Around you the crowd was transforming, the static energy of a gathering becoming the kinetic energy of a movement. People were talking faster, moving with more purpose, the fragmented conversations of moments ago collapsing into a single shared direction. Someone near you shouted something about the Bastille, then someone else, then more. The word moved through the crowd the way fire moves through dry grass. Not because anyone planned it, but because the conditions had been right for a long time and someone had finally provided the spark. You stood in the middle of it and felt something strange. Not triumph, not fear, something quieter than either. Like a man who has put down a very heavy thing and stands for a moment simply noticing the absence of its weight before understanding what comes next. Thomas appeared at your other side, his ink-stained hands gripping a folded pamphlet he had clearly been distributing. His eyes were bright and slightly wild. "They're going to march," he said. "I know," you said. "Are you coming?" You looked in the direction the crowd was moving. The streets beyond the gardens were filling with bodies, the sound of feet on cobblestones building into something that was less like noise and more like weather, the kind that changes the air before it arrives. "Yes," you said. The walk through the city was unlike anything you had experienced before. Not because of the violence, there was little of it yet in those early hours. Because of the sound. The city had always been loud. Paris did not know how to be quiet, but this was a different kind of loudness. Not the chaotic noise of ordinary urban life, but something unified, something with a single pulse beneath it, thousands of separate heartbeats somehow finding the same rhythm without being asked to. You walked near the middle of the crowd, not at the front. The front had been taken by men louder and more certain than you. Men who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had prepared themselves for it in ways you had not. You watched them lead and felt no desire to reclaim whatever brief elevation you had occupied at Palais Royal. That moment had not been about leadership. It had been about the last straw. And last straws, by definition, were not followed by more weight. They were followed by breaking. Henri walked beside you in silence for a long time. Then, quietly, without looking at you, he said, "My father used to say that revolutions are not made by brave men. They are made by men who have finally run out of other options." You considered that. "Which are we?" you asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Both, maybe," he said. "At the same time." You nodded. That felt true. The Bastille appeared ahead of you through the narrow streets like something from a different century, which it was, technically, its stones laid down when the world operated according to rules that no longer applied to anything outside its walls. The fortress was enormous, more enormous than you had remembered from the few times you had passed it in your life without thinking much about it. Its towers rose above the surrounding buildings with a kind of indifference that felt almost personal, the indifference of permanent things toward temporary ones. But it was not permanent. Nothing was permanent. That was what today was teaching you. The crowd pressed forward toward the outer walls. Voices were shouting demands for weapons, for the release of prisoners, for the garrison inside to stand down. The soldiers on the walls looked down at the mass of people below them with expressions you could not read from this distance. You stopped moving forward, not from fear, from a sudden and very clear sense that your part in this particular moment was finished. You had been a spark. The fire did not need the spark anymore. Henri noticed you stopping and paused beside you. "You're not going further?" he said. "No," you said. He looked at you for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if this made complete sense to him, even if he couldn't have explained why. "I'll find you after," he said. "Yes," you said. He moved forward with the crowd. You stayed where you were. What followed happened both very quickly and very slowly. The way significant things often do, compressing and expanding time simultaneously, so that afterward you could never quite reconstruct the exact sequence of events, only the texture of them. There were shots. The sound of them was different from what you expected. Sharper, more abrupt, less dramatic than the sound implied by the word itself. The crowd surged and pulled back and surged again. Voices changed quality, from angry to desperate to something beyond both of those things. You stood at the edge of it all and watched. A man ran past you with blood on his sleeve. Not his own, he seemed unhurt, but his face held the particular blankness of someone who has just seen something that will require significant time to process. A woman knelt beside someone on the ground nearby. You moved toward her instinctively. The man she was kneeling beside was older, perhaps 60, with white hair and a coat that had once been fine and now was not. He was conscious but pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Is he hurt?" you asked. "He fell," the woman said. "The crowd. He couldn't keep his feet." You crouched down on the man's other side. Between the two of you, you helped him to the edge of the street, away from the main press of bodies, and sat him against the wall of a building. He looked at you with clear, sharp eyes that seemed slightly disconnected from the rest of his face. "How long has it been like this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward the noise. "An hour," you said. "Maybe 2. He shook his head slowly. "I have been waiting 40 years for an hour like this," he said. You looked at him. "Were you there?" you asked. "At Palais Royal?" "I was everywhere today," he said. And then, after a pause, "I heard you speak. You said nothing." "You were not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. Someone larger, he said finally, and the ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed his face. Someone louder. I'm sorry to disappoint. You didn't, he said, and his voice, when he said it, carried a weight that had nothing to do with the conversation and everything to do with the 40 years behind it. The Bastille fell in the late afternoon. You heard it before you saw it. A change in the crowd's sound, a shift from struggle to something that took a moment to identify because you had not heard it in so long. Relief, complicated, exhausted, disbelieving relief. The kind that arrives not as joy but as the sudden absence of a pressure you had stopped noticing because it had been there for so long. You made your way closer. The gates were open. People were moving through them, not in the organized way of a military operation but in the stunned, wandering way of people who had breached something they had half believed was unbreachable and were now confronting the reality on the other side, which turned out to be stone corridors and empty cells and the ordinary interior of a thing that had operated primarily as symbol. The streets on the way back were strange. Not empty, Paris was never empty, but altered in some fundamental way that was difficult to articulate. The same cobblestones, the same buildings, the same narrow passages between walls that had never quite dried. But the people moving through them carried themselves differently. Not proudly exactly, more like people who had set down something very heavy and were still in the process of understanding what their bodies felt like without it. Still adjusting to the new balance. Still not entirely certain the weight wouldn't return. You passed a group of men sitting outside a tavern, not drinking, just sitting, staring at the middle distance with the particular expression of people replaying events in their minds and not yet knowing how to feel about what they were seeing. You passed two women talking in low, urgent voices in a doorway, their heads close together, their hands moving in the quick, precise gestures of people communicating something too important for words alone. You passed a boy, maybe 10 years old, standing alone on a corner holding a piece of broken wood like a weapon, though there was nothing around him that required one. His eyes were wide and bright, and he watched everything with the total unblinking attention of someone witnessing something they know they will describe for the rest of their lives. You looked at him as you passed. He looked back at you. Neither of you spoke. Your building appeared ahead of you. The same cracked facade. The same uneven steps leading up to the door. The same smell of damp stone and old wood that had greeted you every day for 11 years, and that you had long since stopped noticing. You noticed it now. You climbed the stairs slowly. Your legs were heavier than they should have been for the distance you had walked. Not physical exhaustion exactly, or not only that. Something else had been consuming energy all day, some continuous low-level effort of presence and attention and feeling, and it had accumulated into a weight that now lived somewhere between your shoulders and the back of your skull. You reached your door, pushed it open. Elise was awake, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a small cup. She looked up when you entered with an expression that was trying very hard to appear calm and not entirely succeeding. You were gone a long time, she said. Yes, you said. I heard things, she said, from outside, shouting, and then later, she paused. It sounded like the city was different. You pulled off your coat and hung it on the hook. It is different, you said. She watched you cross the room and sit down across from her. Are you hurt? She asked. No. Pause. Are you all right? You looked at her mother's mouth and her mother's eyes and the careful, composed expression she wore when she was frightened but didn't want you to know she was frightened. 7 years old, already so practiced at containing herself. Yes, you said, and then, because she deserved more than one word, something happened today that I don't think either of us will fully understand for a long time. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Something good or something bad? She asked. You thought about it honestly. I don't know yet, you said. Maybe both. Maybe it depends on what comes after. She nodded slowly, as if this was a satisfying answer. Then she pushed her cup across the table toward you. There's bread, she said. Henry's wife brought some this afternoon. You looked at the cup, then at the small piece of bread beside it. Something tightened briefly in your chest and then released. "Thank you," you said. You picked up the bread, and for a long moment you simply held it. That night you could not sleep again, but this time it was different from the night before. The previous sleeplessness had been anticipatory, the body and mind running ahead of events, preparing for something unknown. This was something else, a kind of reckoning. You lay in the dark and let the day move through you in sequence. The empty baker's shop, Henry's face, the crowd at Palais Royal, the stone ledge beneath your feet, your own voice carrying further than it should have, the Bastille gate standing open in the late afternoon light. You tried to locate the moment it had become inevitable. You couldn't. That was the strange thing about it. Looking back, every step seemed logical, even obvious. A straight line from the empty shelf to the open gate. But you knew that was the trick memory played on events. Made them feel inevitable in retrospect when they had felt anything but in the moment. In the moment, each step had felt like a choice. And that was perhaps the most important thing. Not that it happened, but that it happened because people chose it, one by one, in small, frightened increments, until the increments added up to something that changed the world. You stared at the ceiling, the same cracked plaster, but even that looked different in the darkness now. Or maybe you were simply looking at it differently. 3 days passed. The city did not calm. If anything, the fall of the Bastille had been less an ending than an opening. A door knocked off its hinges, revealing not resolution but a vast and complicated space beyond it that would take years to navigate. You heard this in conversations on street corners and in doorways. You saw it in the faces of men who had marched on July 12th and were now trying to understand what they had set in motion and where it was going and whether the destination would justify the journey. Henri came by on the second day. He sat at your table and drank water and spoke quietly about what he was hearing. Committees forming, declarations being drafted, power shifting in ways that were visible to everyone and legible to almost no one. "It is bigger than any of us understood," he said. "Yes," you said. "Are you frightened?" You thought about it. "Not of what happened," you said. "Of what comes next." He nodded. "That is the correct thing to be frightened of," he said. After he left, you sat for a long time in the quiet of the room. Elise was outside somewhere, playing with the children from the floor below. A sound you could hear faintly through the window, her laugh rising occasionally above the general noise of the street. You listened to it, held it, turned it over in your mind the way you turned over the day at Palais Royal, looking for the thing underneath it, the essential truth of it. And what you found was this: she had laughed like that before, even on the hardest days, even on the mornings with the empty shelf and the cold room and the particular despair of not knowing how to fix what was broken. She had always found something to laugh about. Children did that, refused the weight adults placed on the world, lived in it anyway, fully, without apology. You thought, whatever comes next, that sound must survive it. Whatever the revolution becomes, whatever it costs, whatever it destroys, whatever it builds in the wreckage, that sound must be part of what remains. That was worth the stone ledge, worth the cracked voice, worth all of it. On the fourth day, you became ill. It started as a tightness in your chest, something you attributed first to the physical exertion of the march, then to the emotional toll of the preceding days, then, as it worsened through the afternoon, to something you could no longer explain away. By evening, breathing had become effortful, not impossible, but requiring attention in a way it never should. You sat at the table and focused on it, the simple mechanical act of drawing air in and releasing it, and tried to determine whether this was something temporary or something else. Something in you already knew, not with panic, with a strange and unexpected clarity. The kind that arrives when the body decides to stop maintaining certain useful fictions. You called for Elise. She came and sat beside you and took your hand without being asked. She was very still, Her eyes watched your face with an attention that was almost unbearable in its completeness. "I need you to do something for me," you said. "Anything," she said immediately. "I need you to remember that what happened 4 days ago was not one person," you said. "It was thousands of people, all of them as ordinary as we are, all of them as frightened. Do you understand?" She nodded. "It wasn't about being brave," you said. "It was about being too tired to be anything else." She squeezed your hand. You looked at her for a long moment, memorizing the way you had looked at her in the early morning 4 days ago before leaving. Only now you understood why. 0:56. The night deepened slowly around you. Elise had fallen asleep beside you, her hands still loosely wrapped around yours, her breathing the same slow, even rhythm it always was. Completely still, untouchable, the way she had always slept even as an infant when the world outside was loud and uncertain. You listened to it. Let it be the thing your mind rested on. The tightness in your chest had not worsened, but it had settled into something permanent feeling. Not a sharp pain, but a heaviness, like the weight of a long day that had decided to stay. You were not frightened. That surprised you slightly. You had expected fear, had braced for it in the way you braced for things you knew were coming but could not prevent. But what arrived instead was something quieter. Something that felt, if you were honest, almost like rest. At some point in the night your eyes closed. Not from decision, from release. And in that space between waking and whatever came after, the city came to you. Not as it had been that morning 4 days ago, tense, electric, holding its breath, but as it was now, moving, alive in a new way. You saw it the way you sometimes saw things in the moments before sleep fully arrived. Not quite vision, not quite dream, but something with the texture of both. The streets you had walked your entire life, familiar down to every crack and corner, but filled now with a different quality of motion. People moving with a purpose that had not been there before. Not resolved, nothing was resolved. You understood that clearly even in this half-state, but directed, oriented towards something. You saw the baker's shop, the door open, bread on the shelf. Not abundance, just enough. The specific, modest, desperately ordinary miracle of enough. You saw Elise, older, perhaps 15, perhaps 20. The dream was imprecise about time in the way dreams always were, but unmistakably her. Her mother's mouth, her mother's eyes, walking through a city that was not the city you had known, harder in some ways, still broken in many, still unfinished in all the ways that cities are always unfinished. But hers, belonging to her in a way it had never quite belonged to you. You watched her walk and felt something open in your chest that had nothing to do with the illness. Something that was the opposite of tightness. Expansion. Like a room you had not known was small, suddenly revealing a wall that could be moved. Further in the dream, or further from waking, you were no longer certain which direction you were traveling. You heard the crowd again. Not the crowd of 4 days ago. Something larger. The sound of a city that had decided, collectively and imperfectly and with great cost, that it would no longer be what it had been. You could not see it clearly, but you could feel it. The way you had felt the shift at Palais Royal, that moment when the air changed quality and the ground beneath you seemed to change state, but amplified now, extended across time, no longer a single moment but a condition. Permanent alteration, a before and after with your voice somewhere in the hinge between them. Not your voice alone, never your voice alone, but yours among the others. One thread in something much larger than any individual thread, which was, you understood now, exactly the right way to be part of something that mattered. You thought about the bread, about the shelf, about the morning it had all started, not 4 days ago but years ago, the first time you had checked and found nothing and stood there in the cold kitchen understanding that this was not a temporary problem. You thought about your wife. Her face came easily, more easily than it had in months, without the usual accompanying ache. Just her face, present, as if she had simply stepped into the room and was standing quietly in the way she had always stood when she was watching you think. You didn't speak to her. She didn't speak to you. It was enough to have her there. More than enough. The city sounds grew softer, not fading exactly, settling, like a fire burning down to something steady and sustainable. No longer the explosive brightness of its beginning, but the reliable warmth of its continuation. You thought, this is what it was for. Not the triumph, not the history, not the dates that would be written in books you would never read by people who would never know your name. The settling, the steadiness, the sound of a city that had changed and was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to live inside the change. Elisa's hand was still in yours. You could feel it warm, small, completely relaxed in sleep. You held it carefully. The way you held things you understood were not permanent. The way you held things you were grateful for. Somewhere in Paris, a bell rang. Distant, single. The sound traveled through streets and walls and the dark summer air and reached you as something barely louder than silence. You listened to it fade. And as it faded, you felt the last of the tightness in your chest release. Not painfully, not dramatically, but simply the way tension leaves a thing when it has finally served its purpose. Your breathing slowed. The room around you, the cracked plaster ceiling, the single window, the walls you had looked at for 11 years, softened at the edges. Not disappearing, just becoming less insistent, less demanding of attention, making room for something else, something warmer, something that felt, in its texture and its temperature, remarkably like the early morning light coming through that window on an ordinary day. Before empty shelves, before cold floors, before the long accumulation of small losses that had built, over years, into the particular weight that a man finally sets down when he has carried it far enough. You had carried it far enough, further than far enough. You had carried it all the way to a stone ledge in a summer garden and opened your mouth and let it become something larger than itself. And now you could set it down. Elisa's breathing was slow and even beside you. The city outside was quieter than it had been in years. Not silent, never silent, but quieter, as if it too was resting, as if it too was learning what it felt like to exist on the other side of the thing it had been building toward for so long. You closed your eyes, and the last thing you were aware of, before the warmth became everything and the room became nothing and the distance between you and the city and the century collapsed into something without edges or weight or the particular cold of stone floors in winter mornings, was her hand, small and warm and completely still, holding yours, and the sound of Paris, alive, changed, continuing, without you now, but because of you, among others, among all the others who had been too tired and too hungry and too human to be anything other than exactly what the moment required. You rested, at last. You rested. Thank you for listening. If this journey moved you, there are more waiting for you here. Each one a different life, a different moment, a different world seen through the eyes of someone who was there. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next one. Sleep well.